The fluorescent lights flickered in the cramped apartment in Manila as Maria Santos kissed her two sleeping children goodbye. It was 3 a.m., and her hands trembled as she placed a handwritten note on the kitchen table. In just 4 hours, she would board a plane to Saudi Arabia, leaving behind everything she had ever known. Her mother stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her weathered face, watching her daughter make the same impossible choice that millions of Filipino families have faced for decades. Little did Maria know that this sacrifice would lead to an extraordinary turn of events that would change not just her life, but the lives of countless others. Maria was 28 years old when she made the decision to leave the Philippines. She had graduated as a registered nurse 3 years earlier, filled with dreams of helping people and building a good life for her family. But reality had other plans. Working at a government hospital in Manila, she earned barely enough to cover rent and food. Her salary was 8,000 pesos a month, roughly $160, for 12-hour shifts that often stretched to 16 hours. She would come home exhausted, her feet aching, her scrubs stained with the evidence of another grueling day. Meanwhile, her two children, Paulo and Elena, were growing up fast. Paulo was 7 and Elena was just 5. They needed books for school, proper meals, a safe place to live. Every night, Maria would do the math in her head, calculating how many months it would take to save enough for their education, for their future. The answer was always the same. It was impossible.
Her mother had been a nurse too, working in the same hospital for 30 years before retiring with a pension that barely covered her medications. She had watched her daughter struggle, watched her grandchildren go without, and finally she sat Maria down one evening and showed her an advertisement. A hospital in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia was recruiting Filipino nurses. The salary was $600 a month, plus housing and meals. It was nearly 4 times what Maria was making. But there was a catch. The contract was for 2 years, with only 1 trip home allowed during that entire period. Maria stared at the paper, her heart pounding. 2 years away from her children. 2 years of missing birthdays, first days of school, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. But it also meant Paulo could go to a good school. It meant Elena could have new shoes that actually fit. It meant her mother could afford her heart medication without choosing between pills and rice. The decision tore her apart, but deep down she already knew what she had to do. Filipino culture runs deep with the concept of utang na loob, a debt of gratitude to family that transcends everything else. Children are raised understanding that their success is not individual but collective, that lifting up your family is the highest honor you can achieve. For nurses like Maria, this cultural value combined with economic necessity created a powerful force that sent them across oceans into the unknown. The Philippines had become what some called a labor export economy, with the government actively encouraging its citizens to work abroad to send money back home. These remittances had become a lifeline for the entire nation, accounting for nearly 9% of the country's economy. Filipino nurses were particularly sought after worldwide, valued for their English proficiency, their strong work ethic, and their innate compassion in caring for others. The night before Maria left, she held her children close, breathing in the scent of their hair, memorizing the feel of their small hands in hers. Paulo tried to be brave, but his lip quivered as he asked when she would come back. Elena didn't understand why her mama had to go so far away. Maria's voice broke as she promised them she would call every week, that she was doing this so they could have a better life. She told them she loved them more than anything in the world. Then she forced herself to let go, to walk away, to be strong. The flight to Riyadh felt like traveling to another planet. Maria had never been on a plane before. She clutched her passport, her nursing license, and a photograph of her children. Around her, other Filipino nurses sat quietly, some crying, some sleeping, all of them carrying the same weight of sacrifice.
When she arrived at the hospital in Saudi Arabia, the reality of her new life hit her immediately. The work was relentless. Nurses were expected to care for twice as many patients as they would in the Philippines, with less support staff and more demanding conditions. The heat was oppressive, the culture completely different, and the loneliness was crushing. Every night, Maria would return to the small room she shared with 3 other Filipino nurses, and she would call home. She would listen to Paulo tell her about his soccer game, Elena sing her a song she learned in school, her mother's updates about the neighborhood. Then she would hang up and cry into her pillow, questioning whether she had made the right choice.
But something else was happening too. The money she sent home each month was transforming her family's life. Paulo enrolled in a private school where he excelled in mathematics. Elena joined a dance class she had always dreamed about. Her mother's health improved with consistent medication and better food. The small apartment they rented was replaced with a modest house with a yard. And Maria kept working, kept sacrificing, kept smiling through her pain. 2 years became 4. 4 became 8. The children grew taller in the photographs they sent. Maria missed Paulo's graduation from elementary school. She missed Elena's first dance recital. She missed Christmas mornings and summer vacations. But she also made it possible for them to dream bigger than she ever could have. During her 10th year in Saudi Arabia, something unexpected happened. One of her regular patients was an elderly American businessman named Robert Harrison, who was in Riyadh for work when he suffered a severe stroke. He was 67 years old, alone in a foreign country, scared and confused. For 3 months, Maria was his primary nurse. She cared for him through the darkest moments of his recovery, helping him relearn how to speak, how to move his paralyzed left side, how to eat without choking. But more than that, she talked to him. She told him about her children back home, about her dreams for their future. She showed him photographs and read him the letters Paulo and Elena sent. She made him laugh when he wanted to give up. She held his hand when he cried in frustration. She treated him not as a patient, but as a human being who deserved dignity and compassion. Robert had been a successful executive at a major technology company in California. He had built his wealth over decades of hard work, innovation, and smart investments. But he had also lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier, and his relationship with his adult children had become distant and strained. Lying in that hospital bed in Saudi Arabia, being cared for by this Filipino nurse who had sacrificed so much for her own children, something shifted in him. He saw in Maria a kind of love he had forgotten existed. Selfless, unconditional, willing to endure pain for the sake of others. He started asking her questions about the Philippines, about the nursing system, about why so many skilled professionals had to leave their country to survive. When Robert finally recovered enough to return to California, he made Maria promise to stay in touch. She thought it was just the gratitude of a patient, the kind of temporary connection that fades once people return to their normal lives. She gave him her email address to be polite and went back to her routine of night shifts and video calls home. But Robert didn't forget. He couldn't. Back in California, recovering in his comfortable home in San Francisco, he kept thinking about Maria. He did research on Filipino nurses, learning about the systemic issues that forced them abroad. He read about nurses earning $12 a day in Philippine hospitals while being expected to care for 40 or 50 patients per shift. He discovered that over 300,000 Filipino nurses were working overseas, creating a critical shortage back home. The more he learned, the more disturbed he became. 6 months after returning home, Robert sent Maria an email that would change everything. He told her he had been talking to some of his colleagues from his years in the tech industry. He told her about an idea he couldn't stop thinking about. And then he asked her a question that seemed too impossible to be real. Would she be willing to help him start a foundation to improve nursing conditions in the Philippines?
He wanted to build training facilities, provide scholarships, and work with hospitals to increase wages and reduce patient loads. He wanted to make it possible for Filipino nurses to build good lives at home, so they wouldn't have to choose between their careers and their families the way Maria had. Maria read the email 3 times, certain she had misunderstood. This couldn't be real. People didn't do things like this. But the next email contained more details, specific plans, and an invitation to join a video call with Robert and 2 other retired executives who wanted to be part of the project. The video call happened on a Sunday afternoon, which was Maria's day off. She sat in her small room, her hands shaking, as Robert's face appeared on the screen. He looked healthy, strong, completely transformed from the broken man she had nursed back to health. Beside him were 2 other men, both successful business people who had been moved by Robert's story. They had each agreed to contribute significant funding to establish the Harrison Santos Foundation for Nursing Excellence in the Philippines. They had chosen the name deliberately, honoring both Robert's vision and Maria's sacrifice. The foundation would start with a $10 million initial fund, with plans to grow through additional donations and partnerships. Their first project would be to establish a nursing training center in Manila with state-of-the-art facilities. The second would be a scholarship program, providing free nursing education to 200 students per year. The third would be a salary supplement program, working with Philippine hospitals to increase nursing wages to competitive levels. But here is where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. Robert told Maria that he wanted her to return to the Philippines, not as a nurse, but as the executive director of the foundation. She would oversee all programs, manage the staff, and ensure that the foundation's resources actually reached the nurses who needed them most. The salary would be $80,000 a year, more than she had ever imagined earning. She would have full medical benefits, housing assistance, and a travel budget. Most importantly, she would be home. She would be with Paulo and Elena. She would be with her mother. After 15 years of sacrifice, she could finally come home. Maria couldn't speak. Tears poured down her face as the magnitude of what was being offered sank in. This wasn't just a job. This was redemption. This was validation that her sacrifice had meant something. This was the universe, or God, or whatever force guided the world, saying that her years of pain had not been in vain. The other executives on the call smiled, understanding her overwhelmed silence. Robert's voice was gentle as he said, "You took care of me when I was at my lowest. You showed me what real compassion looks like. Now let me take care of you, and through you, thousands of other nurses who deserve better." Maria found her voice finally, broken and trembling. She asked if this was really happening, if she was really going to go home. Robert nodded. The paperwork was already being prepared. Within 3 months, if she accepted, she would be on a plane back to the Philippines. But this time, she wouldn't be leaving. She would be staying. The flight home was nothing like the flight that had taken her away all those years ago. Maria sat in business class, a luxury she had never experienced, watching the clouds drift past the window. She thought about Paulo, now 22 and studying engineering at university. She thought about Elena, 20 and training to become a nurse herself, following in her mother's footsteps despite having seen the cost it demanded. She thought about all the years of video calls and missed moments, all the nights crying into her pillow, all the sacrifices that had brought her to this moment. When the plane landed in Manila, Paulo and Elena were waiting at the airport. They had grown into adults while she was away, but their faces still held the children she had left behind. They ran to her, and for the first time in 15 years, Maria held her children in her arms on Philippine soil. She sobbed, they sobbed, her mother sobbed, and the other passengers walked around them, this reunion of a family that had been broken by necessity and was finally being made whole.
The Harrison Santos Foundation officially launched 6 months later in a ceremony attended by government officials, hospital administrators, and hundreds of nurses from across the Philippines. Maria stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, and told her story. She talked about the impossible choices Filipino nurses face, the families torn apart by economic necessity, the expertise and compassion that flows out of the country because there is no way to sustain it at home. She talked about Robert, about how one person's gratitude had sparked a movement to change an entire system. And then she announced the Foundation's first major initiative. They had partnered with 5 major hospitals in Manila to implement a pilot program increasing nursing salaries by 40% and reducing patient-to-nurse ratios by half. They had awarded scholarships to 200 nursing students from low-income families. They had opened the doors to their training facility, equipped with the latest medical technology and staffed by experienced nurse educators. But perhaps most importantly, they had started a conversation. The foundation began advocating for policy changes at the national level, working with legislators to pass laws protecting nurses' rights, ensuring fair wages, and improving working conditions. They brought international attention to the issue, highlighting the irony of a country that exported some of the world's best nurses while struggling to provide adequate health care to its own citizens. Robert attended the ceremony, walking with only a slight limp, the last remaining evidence of his stroke. He watched Maria speak with pride, knowing that his investment was already bearing fruit. Later, in a private interview with a Filipino news network, he explained his motivation simply. "Maria saved my life," he said. "She gave me back my health, my future, my ability to enjoy my grandchildren, and maybe repair my relationships with my children. And she did it while suffering a pain I can barely imagine, being separated from her own children for my benefit. How could I not try to do something? How could I not try to make sure that kind of sacrifice becomes unnecessary?" The interview went viral, viewed millions of times across social media platforms. People were moved by the story, by the recognition that behind every nurse, every healthcare worker, every person in service to others, there was a story of sacrifice that often went unnoticed and unappreciated. The foundation's impact grew exponentially. Other wealthy individuals and corporations were inspired to contribute. Within 2 years, the scholarship program expanded to 500 students annually. Within 5 years, they had partnered with 30 hospitals across the Philippines. They established satellite training centers in rural areas where nursing education had been virtually inaccessible. They created a loan forgiveness program for nurses willing to work in underserved communities. They funded research on improving healthcare delivery systems. And, most importantly, they helped change the narrative around nursing in the Philippines, from a profession you had to leave the country to succeed in, to one where you could build a meaningful career at home. Maria's children both graduated from university. Paulo became an engineer, and true to the family's spirit of service, he focused his career on developing affordable housing solutions for low-income families. Elena became a registered nurse, but unlike her mother, she was able to start her career in Manila, working in a hospital partnered with the Harrison Santos Foundation, where she earned a living wage and cared for a reasonable number of patients. On the 5th anniversary of the foundation, Maria received an award from the Philippine Nurses Association for her contributions to the profession. Standing on that stage, accepting recognition from her peers, she thought about the girl who had boarded a plane to Saudi Arabia 20 years earlier, terrified and heartbroken, believing she had no choice. She thought about all the nurses still making that same impossible decision, still leaving their families behind, still sacrificing their own happiness for the sake of those they loved. And she renewed her commitment to the foundation's mission. Because while her story had a happy ending, there were still hundreds of thousands of Filipino nurses around the world who deserved to come home.
there were still millions of families being torn apart by an economic system that valued profit over people, that treated healthcare workers as expendable resources rather than the heroes they were.
Today, Maria is 48 years old. She still serves as the executive director of the Harrison Santos Foundation, which has grown into one of the most influential nursing advocacy organizations in Asia. She has expanded the foundation's work to other countries facing similar challenges, partnering with organizations in India, Indonesia, and several African nations. She has spoken at international conferences about healthcare worker migration, labor rights, and the hidden costs of the global nursing shortage. But more importantly, she goes home every night to a house where her mother lives comfortably in her retirement. She has dinner with Paolo and his wife. She visits Elena at the hospital where she works, sometimes stopping by to offer advice or simply to watch her daughter provide the same compassionate care that Maria once gave to strangers on the other side of the world.
Robert Harrison passed away 2 years ago at the age of 74, surrounded by his children and grandchildren with whom he had successfully reconciled in his final years. In his will, he left an additional $5 million to the foundation, ensuring its work would continue long after he was gone. At his funeral, Maria gave the eulogy. She talked about the man who had been her patient, her friend, her partner in creating change. She talked about how a single act of compassion, given freely in a hospital room in Saudi Arabia, had rippled outward to touch thousands of lives. She talked about the power of gratitude, not just feeling it, but acting on it, transforming it into something tangible that makes the world better.
The Harrison Santos Foundation continues to grow and evolve, but at its core, it remains committed to a simple principle. Healthcare workers, particularly nurses who form the backbone of medical care around the world, deserve to be valued, compensated fairly, and given the support they need to do their incredibly difficult jobs without having to sacrifice everything that makes life worth living. Maria's story is extraordinary, but it shouldn't be. No one should have to leave their children for 2 decades to earn a living wage. No one should have to choose between their career and their family. No one should have to sacrifice so much for so long just to survive. The fact that millions of people do make these sacrifices every day, that they endure the pain and the loneliness and the heartbreak, speaks to both the best and worst of our global society. The best because it shows the incredible strength, love, and dedication of people like Maria who will do anything for their families. The worst because it reveals how deeply broken our systems are that such sacrifices are necessary in the first place.
When people ask Maria if she regrets the years she spent away from her children, she pauses before answering. She could have been there for their childhood, she says. She could have been the one to tuck them in at night, to help with homework, to kiss scraped knees and dry tears. Those lost years can never be recovered, and the pain of that loss will always be part of her story. But she also knows that her sacrifice gave her children opportunities they never would have had otherwise. It gave them education, security, and the freedom to pursue their dreams. And ultimately, it led to the creation of something that has helped thousands of other families stay together. So no, she doesn't regret it. She wishes the world was different, that such sacrifices weren't necessary. But she doesn't regret choosing to do everything in her power to give her children a better life.
And that, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson of Maria's story. It's not really about one nurse and one grateful patient, though their connection is beautiful and meaningful. It's about the millions of people around the world who make impossible choices every day, who endure unimaginable hardships, who sacrifice their own happiness for the sake of others. It's about recognizing that every nurse, every healthcare worker, every person in service to others has their own story of sacrifice. And it's about having the courage and compassion to not just appreciate those sacrifices, but to work toward a world where they become unnecessary. Maria Santos left her children for 20 years to care for strangers in a foreign land. What she received in return was not just financial compensation or professional recognition. She received the chance to come home. She received the opportunity to transform her pain into purpose, to ensure that other nurses wouldn't have to make the same impossible choices she did. She received validation that her sacrifice mattered, that her compassion had value beyond measure. And she received the greatest gift of all, the ability to spend the rest of her life with the children she had loved from thousands of miles away, no longer separated by oceans and economics, but finally, beautifully, home.
If this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to it.